The slap echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot, leaving my cheek burning and my ears ringing. My stepmother, Diana, stood over me, her perfectly manicured nails still trembling from the force of the blow, her face twisted with a rage I'd never seen directed at anyone else in our household. What made it worse wasn't just the physical pain radiating across my face, but the cold satisfaction gleaming in her eyes as she watched me stumble backward against the granite countertop. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maybe next time you'll think twice before disrespecting me in my own home, she hissed, straightening her designer blouse as if nothing had happened. The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and my own ragged breathing. I pressed my palm against my stinging cheek, feeling the heat beneath my skin, knowing it would leave a mark. My name is Zara, and at 22, I thought I'd finally found some stability in my life. After my mother passed away when I was 16, my father Marcus remarried Diana within 2 years. At first, she seemed like a blessing. Beautiful, charming, and seemingly eager to step into a motherly role. She had this way of lighting up a room when other people were around, always perfectly dressed, always saying the right things. My father was smitten, and honestly, I was grateful to see him happy again after years of grief. But behind closed doors, Diana was an entirely different person. The mask would slip the moment we were alone, revealing someone cold, calculating, and deeply resentful of my existence. It started small, subtle digs about my appearance, comments about how I was taking up space in what she now considered her home, passive-aggressive remarks about my college expenses. My father, still grieving and perhaps willfully blind to her true nature, never seemed to notice these moments. Over the years, Diana's behavior escalated. She would rearrange my mother's belongings that my father had allowed me to keep, claiming she was redecorating. She threw away sentimental items, saying they were cluttering the house. When I complained to my father, Diana would put on her concerned stepmother act, suggesting I was having trouble adjusting and might benefit from therapy. She was masterful at making me look like the problem child, while positioning herself as the patient, caring stepmother trying her best with a difficult situation. The incident that led to that slap had been building for weeks. Diana had been pressuring my father to make me move out, claiming I needed to learn independence. Never mind that I was in my final year at the local university, maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working part-time at a bookstore to help with expenses. Never mind that I did all my own laundry, cleaned up after myself, and rarely brought friends over to avoid disturbing their space. In Diana's narrative, I was a freeloader who needed to be pushed out of the nest. That morning, I'd made the mistake of questioning her story about my mother's jewelry. Diana claimed she'd taken several pieces to be professionally cleaned, but I'd seen her wearing my mother's emerald earrings to dinner the night before. When I gently asked about getting them back, since they held tremendous sentimental value, Diana's facade cracked completely. "Your mother is dead, Zara. These are my earrings now. Your father gave them to me, and frankly, your obsession with the past is becoming unhealthy. Maybe it's time you accepted that this is my house now, with my rules and my belongings." I stood there in shock, not just at her words, but at the casual cruelty with which she delivered them. That's when I made my fatal mistake. I called her out on her lies. I told her I knew she was manipulating my father, that I saw through her fake concerned stepmother act, and that taking my mother's jewelry without permission was theft, regardless of what she told herself. That's when she hit me. The force of the slap sent me stumbling, but it was the look in her eyes that truly shook me. There was no regret, no shock at her own actions, just pure, undiluted satisfaction. She'd wanted to do that for years, and finally having an excuse had clearly been liberating for her. "You ungrateful little brat. After everything I've done for you, after all the patience I've shown dealing with your attitude, this is how you repay me? Well, I'm done pretending to care about your feelings. This is my house, and if you can't respect that, maybe you should find somewhere else to live. I touched my burning cheek again, tasting blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. I'm telling my father about this. Diana laughed, actually laughed as if I'd told the funniest joke she'd ever heard. Go ahead, sweetheart. Tell Marcus that his grieving daughter is so desperate for attention that she's making up stories about his loving wife. Tell him that you're so resentful of our happiness that you're willing to lie and create drama. See how that works out for you. The confidence in her voice chilled me more than the slap had. She knew exactly how this would play out. She'd spent 4 years carefully crafting her image as the perfect stepmother while subtly undermining my credibility. Every time I'd tried to expose her behavior, she had managed to twist it around, making me look unstable, jealous, or difficult. My father, desperate to believe in his second chance at happiness, had always chosen to trust Diana's version of events. I watched her smooth down her hair and check her reflection in the chrome surface of the refrigerator, transforming back into the poised woman everyone else knew. By the time my father came home from work, she'd be the picture of concerned stepmotherhood, probably with some story about how worried she was about my increasing erratic behavior. But as I stood there, my cheek throbbing and my heart racing, I realized something important. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't going to let Diana control the narrative. Because while she'd been busy perfecting her performance, I'd been quietly documenting everything. You see, 6 months earlier, I'd started recording our conversations, not out of any grand plan for revenge, but out of pure self-preservation. Diana's gaslighting had become so sophisticated that I'd begun questioning my own memory of events. She would deny things I clearly remembered, twist my words until I doubted my own perceptions, and present completely different versions of conversations to my father. I'd started recording initially just to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. The app on my phone had become my lifeline to sanity. Hidden behind a fake calculator icon, it had captured months of Diana's true personality. Her cruel comments about my mother, her manipulative phone calls with friends where she complained about being stuck with Marcus's baggage, her calculating discussions about how to get me out of the house permanently. I had hours of audio that revealed the real Diana, the one my father had never seen. But I'd never planned to use the recordings. They were just my private proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Even as the evidence mounted, part of me had hoped things would somehow improve, that Diana would eventually soften, or that my father would finally see through her act on his own. The slap changed everything. Standing in that kitchen, my cheek burning, and Diana already preparing her next manipulation, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I was done being the victim in Diana's carefully scripted drama. I was done protecting a woman who had just physically assaulted me, and I was definitely done allowing my father to remain willfully blind to what was happening in his own home. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, my fingers finding the familiar fake calculator app. With a few quick taps, I started a new recording just as Diana finished checking her appearance. "You know," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I think you're right. I should definitely tell Dad about this conversation." Diana turned back to me with that same cold smile. "By all means, Zara, tell him how his unstable daughter attacked his wife and then made up stories when confronted about her behavior. I'm sure he'll be very understanding." "Is that really the story you want to go with?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "That I attacked you? Who's he going to believe?" Diana stepped closer, her voice dropping to the same icy tone she'd used about my mother's jewelry. "You want to know the truth, Zara. I never wanted you here. Your father comes with baggage, and you're the biggest piece of it. I've been patient because I love Marcus, but my patience has limits. You're 22 years old.
Most people your age have moved out and started their own lives.
Instead, you're here playing the tragic orphan, living off your father's guilt about your mother's death. I kept my expression neutral, though my heart was pounding. The phone in my hand was capturing every cruel word. The jewelry situation is just the beginning, Diana continued, clearly feeling emboldened by what she perceived as my defeated silence. Your mother's things have been taking up space in my home for too long. I've been considerate about it, but frankly, it's time to move on. Your father needs to stop living in the past, and having shrines to his dead wife scattered around the house isn't helping anyone. So you just decided to take her jewelry? I managed to ask. I decided to help my husband heal, Diana corrected, her voice taking on that fake therapeutic tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. Keeping mementos is one thing, but this obsession with material objects isn't healthy for any of us. Besides, jewelry is meant to be worn, not locked away in a drawer gathering dust. Your mother would want her things to bring joy to someone who's alive. The audacity of using my mother's hypothetical wishes to justify theft left me speechless for a moment. Diana interpreted my silence as submission and pressed her advantage. This is exactly why you need to move out, Zara. You're stuck in the past, clinging to things that are keeping you from growing up. I've been trying to help you see that, but clearly, gentle encouragement isn't working. Maybe what you need is some tough love. Is that what the slap was? Tough love? Diana's eyes flashed dangerously. You got exactly what you deserved for your disrespectful attitude. I've been nothing but patient with you, but I won't be spoken to like that in my own home. If you can't treat me with basic respect, then maybe you don't belong here. And you think Dad will see it that way? Marcus will see exactly what I tell him to see, Diana said with absolute certainty. He trusts me, Zara. He loves me, and he's tired of dealing with the constant drama you create. Do you really think he wants to choose between his wife and his difficult daughter? Because if you force that choice, you're not going to like the outcome. She moved closer until she was standing directly in front of me, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than if she'd been shouting. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize for your disrespectful behavior. You're going to accept that this is my house and I make the rules. And you're going to start making serious plans to move out within the next 2 months. If you do that, we can all pretend this unpleasant conversation never happened. And if I don't? Diana's smile was sharp as a blade. Then I'll make your life so miserable that moving out will seem like a mercy. You think the last 4 years have been difficult? Sweetheart, I've been holding back. I can make your father believe you're having a complete mental breakdown. I can convince him that you're a danger to yourself and others. I can have you committed if necessary. Don't test me on this. The casual way she threatened to have me institutionalized sent ice through my veins. This wasn't just garden variety stepmother jealousy. Diana was genuinely dangerous, and she just revealed exactly how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. You're insane, I whispered. I'm practical, Diana corrected, and I'm done playing games with you. Your father and I have plans for our future, and those plans don't include a grown daughter living in our basement and stirring up drama. You can make this easy on everyone by leaving voluntarily, or you can make it hard on yourself by forcing me to take more drastic measures. The choice is yours. She turned to leave, then paused at the kitchen doorway. Oh, and Zara, if you're thinking about running to your father with some sob story about how mean I was to you, remember that you don't have any proof of this conversation. It's your word against mine, and we both know how that usually works out. The irony of her words, given the phone recording everything in my hand, almost made me laugh. Almost. But I kept my expression neutral and watched her walk away, her heels clicking confidently on the hardwood floor. She was already planning her next performance, already crafting the story she'd tell my father about my increasingly concerning behavior. I waited until I heard her footsteps on the stairs before stopping the recording. My hands were shaking as I saved the file and backed it up to cloud storage. 23 minutes of audio that completely demolished Diana's carefully constructed facade. 23 minutes that proved I wasn't crazy, wasn't making things up, wasn't the problem child she'd convinced everyone I was. But having the evidence and knowing how to use it were two different things. Diana had been right about one thing. My father had consistently chosen to believe her version of events over mine.
Even with proof, I couldn't be sure he'd be willing to face the truth about the woman he'd married. I spent the rest of the afternoon in my room, holding an ice pack to my cheek and planning my next move. The smart thing would be to wait for the right moment, to catch my father when he was relaxed and receptive, to present the evidence carefully and let him draw his own conclusions. The emotional thing would be to confront him the moment he walked through the door, to demand he listen to what his wife had really said to me. But as I sat there, touching my tender cheek and thinking about Diana's threats, I realized there was a third option, one that would force my father to confront the truth while simultaneously protecting me from Diana's promised retaliation. You see, Diana had made one crucial mistake in her calculated threats. She assumed I was as isolated and powerless as I'd been 4 years ago when she'd first married my father. She didn't know about the support network I'd quietly built over the years, the relationships I'd maintained despite her attempts to isolate me from extended family and friends. My father had a sister, Aunt Rebecca, who lived across the country, but who'd stayed in touch despite Diana's subtle discouragement of those relationships. Rebecca had never quite bought Diana's perfect stepmother act, though she'd been too polite to say anything directly. She'd also been my mother's best friend from college, and she remembered exactly what my mother's jewelry looked like. There was also my father's business partner, David, who'd known our family for decades. He'd watched Diana's behavior at family gatherings and company events, and while he'd never said anything outright, I'd caught him giving her some very thoughtful looks over the years. David was the kind of man who paid attention to details, and I suspect he'd noticed things that my love-struck father had missed. Most importantly, there was my father's mother, Grandma Helen, who lived in a senior community about an hour away. Helen had never warmed to Diana, though she'd been diplomatic about her feelings for my father's sake. But she'd also been fiercely protective of me since my mother's death, and she'd made it clear that I always had a place in her life regardless of what happened with Diana. These people cared about me, trusted me, and most importantly, they knew my character well enough to recognize that I wouldn't make false accusations. If I presented her with evidence of Diana's behavior, they would believe me. And if they believed me, they would make it impossible for my father to dismiss my claims as the delusions of an unstable daughter. But first, I needed to survive whatever performance Diana was about to give when my father came home. I heard his car in the driveway around 6, followed by the familiar sound of his key in the front door. Diana's voice floated up from downstairs, warm and welcoming as always, when she greeted him. She was already setting the stage for whatever story she decided to tell. About 10 minutes later, I heard my father's heavy footsteps on the stairs. He knocked softly on my door, his voice gentle when he called my name. "Zara, sweetheart, can we talk?" I opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his expression troubled but not angry. Diana had chosen her approach carefully. Whatever story she'd told him, it had been designed to make him concerned rather than furious. "Dad, I need to tell you what happened today."
He sighed and sat heavily on my desk chair, looking older than his 52 years. "Diana told me you two had some kind of argument. She's pretty upset, honey. She says you've been acting strange lately, and that things got heated when she tried to talk to you about it." I studied his face, looking for any sign that he'd noticed my swollen cheek, but the lighting in my room was dim, and I'd been careful to ice it regularly. The swelling had gone down enough that it might not be immediately obvious, especially to someone who wasn't looking for it. "What exactly did she tell you?" I asked carefully. My father rubbed his temples, a gesture I recognized from my childhood. He'd done the same thing during the worst days of my mother's illness, when the stress of watching her fade away had been almost unbearable. "She said you've been increasingly hostile toward her, making accusations and causing arguments. She's worried about you, Zara. We both are. She thinks maybe the stress of school and planning for after graduation is getting to you." The masterful manipulation in Diana's story was almost impressive. She'd positioned herself as the concerned stepmother while framing my legitimate complaints as signs of mental instability. She'd even provided a reasonable explanation for my supposed breakdown, academic stress, that my father would absolutely believe. "Dad," I said, sitting on my bed so we were at eye level, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Diana didn't just argue with me today, she hit me." The change in his expression was immediate. Confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been fear all flickered across his face in rapid succession. Zara, that's a very serious accusation. It's not an accusation, it's what happened. I turned my head slightly so he could see my cheek in better light. Look. He leaned forward, studying my face with the intensity he usually reserved for important business documents. I watched him notice the slight swelling, the faint red mark that the ice hadn't been able to completely eliminate. "How did this happen?" he asked quietly. "She slapped me, hard, after she told me that Mom's jewelry belongs to her now and that I need to get over my obsession with the past." My father sat back in his chair, his face pale. "Zara, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Everything." So I did. I told him about the jewelry, about Diana's cruel comments about my mother, about the escalating argument that had led to the slap. I told him about Diana's threats, her confidence that he would believe her over me, her ultimatum about moving out. I watched his expression grow darker with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "These are very serious allegations, sweetheart. If Diana really did hit you, that's completely unacceptable. But I need to understand why this is the first time something like this happened." "It's not the first time she's been cruel to me, Dad. It's just the first time she's been physical about it." "What do you mean?" And that's when I realized the moment had come. Not to play the recording yet, that would be my nuclear option, but to test whether my father was finally ready to hear the truth about his wife. "Diana has been systematically cruel to me for years, Dad. She's just been very careful to hide it from you. She throws away Mom's things and claims she's decluttering. She makes comments about how I'm a burden on your happiness. She's been pressuring you to make me move out since I started college. The only difference is that today, she finally lost control and hit me." My father's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, confusion, and something that looked like dawning horror. "Zara, if this is true, why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because every time I tried, she made me look like the problem. Remember when I complained about her throwing away Mom's garden journal? You sided with her about letting go of the past. Remember when I said she was being cold to me? You said I needed to give her more of a chance. Every single time I tried to tell you what she was really like, you chose to believe her version instead. The truth of that hung in the air between us." My father's shoulders sagged as he seemed to review years of dismissed complaints and explained away conflicts. "Oh God," he whispered, "have I been that blind?" "Not blind," I said gently, "just hoping that the woman you married was the woman she pretended to be when you were around." He stood up abruptly and began pacing my small room. "I need to talk to her. If she really hit you, if she's been treating you the way you're describing—" "Dad, wait." I stood to, catching his arm. "Before you confront her, there's something else you need to know. Something that will make it impossible for her to deny what kind of person she really is." He stopped pacing and looked at me with a mixture of dread and curiosity. "I have recordings," I said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. My father stared at me as if I'd just spoken in a foreign language. Recordings? Months of them. Her real voice when she thought no one would ever hear it, including today's conversation, right up until she threatened to have me committed if I didn't move out voluntarily. My father sat back down heavily, as if his legs could no longer support him. "You recorded her?" "I started recording our conversations because her gaslighting was so sophisticated that I began questioning my own memory. I needed proof that I wasn't going crazy. I never planned to use them against her. They were just for my own sanity. But now?" I pulled out my phone and found the recording from that afternoon. "Now I think it's time you heard who you really married." My father looked at the phone in my hand as if it were a loaded weapon, which, in a way, it was. "Are you sure about this, sweetheart? Once I hear it, I can't unhear it. Dad, she hit me. She threatened me. She's been emotionally abusing me for years while convincing you I was the problem." My father's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, confusion, and something that looked like dawning horror.
Zara, if this is true, why didn't you tell me sooner? Because every time I tried, she made me look like the problem. Remember when I complained about her throwing away Mom's garden journal? You sided with her about letting go of the past. Remember when I said she was being cold to me? You said I needed to give her more of a chance. Every single time I tried to tell you what she was really like, you chose to believe her version instead. The truth of that hung in the air between us. My father's shoulders sagged as he seemed to review years of dismissed complaints and explained away conflicts. "Oh God," he whispered, "have I been that blind?" "Not blind," I said gently, "just hoping that the woman you married was the woman she pretended to be when you were around." He stood up abruptly and began pacing my small room. "I need to talk to her. If she really hit you, if she's been treating you the way you're describing—" "Dad, wait," I stood to, catching his arm. "Before you confront her, there's something else you need to know. Something that will make it impossible for her to deny what kind of person she really is." He stopped pacing and looked at me with a mixture of dread and curiosity. "I have recordings," I said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. My father stared at me as if I'd just spoken in a foreign language. Recordings? Months of them, her real voice when she thought no one would ever hear it, including today's conversation, right up until she threatened to have me committed if I didn't move out voluntarily. My father sat back down heavily, as if his legs could no longer support him. "You recorded her?" "I started recording our conversations because her gaslighting was so sophisticated that I began questioning my own memory. I needed proof that I wasn't going crazy. I never planned to use them against her. They were just for my own sanity. But now?" I pulled out my phone and found the recording from that afternoon. "Now I think it's time you heard who you really married." My father looked at the phone in my hand as if it were a loaded weapon, which, in a way, it was. "Are you sure about this, sweetheart? Once I hear it, I can't unhear it. Dad, she hit me. She threatened me. She's been emotionally abusing me for years while convincing you I was the problem."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"I think it's time you knew the truth." He nodded slowly, bracing himself for what was coming. I pressed play on the most recent recording, the one that captured Diana's mask falling away completely. Her voice filled the room, cold and cruel in a way my father had never heard before. "Your mother is dead, Zara. These are my earrings now. Your father gave them to me, and frankly, your obsession with the past is becoming unhealthy." I watched my father's face as he heard his wife's voice delivering that casual cruelty. Watched him flinch when the sound of the slap came through clearly on the recording. Watched his expression change from disbelief to horror to a kind of grief I hadn't seen since my mother's funeral. The recording played on, capturing Diana's threats, her manipulation tactics, her complete dismissal of my humanity. By the time it ended, my father was sitting with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "My God," he whispered. "My God, Zara, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Dad, I failed you. I completely failed you. I brought that woman into our home, into our family, and I let her torment you for years. I let her convince me that you were the problem when she was the one." He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "Can you ever forgive me?" The conversation that followed was one of the most painful and healing of my life. My father listened to more recordings, each one revealing new layers of Diana's deception. He heard her complaining to friends about being stuck with Marcus's baggage. He heard her planning ways to drive me out of the house. He heard her laughing about how easy it was to manipulate him by playing the concerned stepmother. With each recording, I watched years of denial crumble away. My father had genuinely loved Diana, or at least the version of her that she'd presented to him. Learning that the woman he'd shared his bed with for 4 years was capable of such calculated cruelty was devastating him, but it was also liberating him from the impossible position Diana had put him in, forcing him to choose between believing his daughter and believing his wife. Now he knew there was no choice to make.
There was only the truth, recorded in Diana's own voice, impossible to deny or rationalize away. "What do we do now?" he asked after we'd listened to several recordings. "We protect ourselves," I said, "because Diana isn't going to go quietly when she realizes her game is over." And that's when I told him about my plan, not just to expose Diana's behavior, but to ensure that when the inevitable confrontation came, we would have allies, witnesses, and support. Because Diana was smart, manipulative, and desperate. When cornered, she would fight back with everything she had. But this time, we would be ready for her. The first call I made was to Aunt Rebecca. It was nearly midnight on the East Coast, but I knew she'd answer. She always did when it came to family emergencies, and this definitely qualified. My father sat beside me on my bed, still processing the recordings we'd played, still grappling with the reality of who he'd been married to for 4 years. "Zara?" Rebecca's voice came through immediately, alert despite the late hour. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" "Aunt Becca, I need your help. Dad's here with me, and we have a situation with Diana." I could hear her shifting, probably sitting up in bed. Rebecca had always been protective of me, especially after Mom died. She'd sensed something was off about Diana from the beginning, though she'd kept her concerns mostly to herself out of respect for Dad's happiness. "What kind of situation?" "She hit me today, and we have it recorded, along with months of audio that proves she's been emotionally abusing me while making Dad think I was the problem." The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. When Rebecca finally spoke, her voice was deadly calm. "She did what?" "There's more, Aunt Becca. She's been stealing Mom's jewelry and telling Dad that I'm mentally unstable. Today, she threatened to have me committed if I don't move out in 2 months." "Put me on speaker," Rebecca said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Marcus, are you hearing this?" Dad leaned closer to the phone. "I'm here, Rebecca, and yes, I've heard the recordings. God help me, I've been completely blind." "How bad is it?" I spent the next 20 minutes playing selective recordings for Rebecca while Dad filled in the details I'd shared with him. I watched her grow angrier with each revelation, her lawyer instincts kicking in as she started asking pointed questions about documentation and witnesses. "Zara, I want you to send me copies of every recording immediately," she said when we finished. "Upload them to a secure cloud drive and give me access. We need to preserve this evidence properly." "Why? We're not pressing charges." "Yet," Rebecca corrected. "And even if you don't, Marcus is going to need this documentation for the divorce proceedings. A woman who threatens to have her stepdaughter institutionalized isn't going to make separation easy." Dad flinched at the word divorce, but he didn't argue. The recordings had made it clear that his marriage was built on deception and manipulation. There was no coming back from what we'd heard. "There's something else," Rebecca continued. "I'm flying out tomorrow. I know Diana's type, and she's not going to take this lying down. When cornered, people like her become dangerous. You need support, and you need witnesses to whatever she tries next." "Rebecca, you don't have to." "Marcus, shut up," she interrupted. "My niece was assaulted in your house by your wife. I'm not staying 3,000 miles away while that woman plans her next move. Besides, I've been wanting to have a conversation with Diana for years. Now, I finally have a good reason." After we hung up, Dad and I spent another hour strategizing. We decided to wait until Rebecca arrived before confronting Diana directly. In the meantime, we would document everything, back up all evidence, and quietly reach out to other family members who needed to know what was happening. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Diana's voice downstairs, bright and cheerful as she made breakfast. She was humming, actually humming, as if yesterday's assault had never happened. The casual normalcy of it made my stomach turn. Dad had already left for work early, claiming he needed to handle some urgent business matters. In reality, he'd gone to his office to call his lawyer and start documenting the situation. We'd agreed that maintaining normal routines would be safest until Rebecca arrived and we could present Diana with the evidence as a united front. I stayed in my room, working on my laptop and avoiding any interaction with Diana. But around noon, she knocked on my door with that fake, concerned voice she used when she wanted to seem caring. "Zara, honey, I made lunch. Why don't you come downstairs and we can talk about yesterday?" I opened the door to find her standing there with a plate of sandwiches and her most sympathetic expression. She'd changed clothes since morning and was now wearing a soft pink sweater that made her look maternal and harmless. Everything about her appearance was calculated to project warmth and concern. "I've been thinking about our conversation," she continued, stepping slightly closer. "I think we both said things we didn't mean. I want to apologize for losing my temper." The audacity of calling her assault losing her temper would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. She was already working on her revised narrative, softening her actions while preparing to blame me for provoking her. "That's thoughtful of you," I said, carefully, not moving to let her into my room. "I know things have been tense between us lately, and I take responsibility for that. Maybe I've been too focused on what I thought was best for you instead of listening to what you actually needed." She was good. I had to give her that. This version of Diana sounded reasonable, self-reflective, and genuinely remorseful. If I hadn't heard her real thoughts on recording, I might have been tempted to believe this performance. "I think we both need some time to process what happened," I replied diplomatically. "Of course, sweetheart, but I don't want this to fester between us. Your father loves us both, and the last thing I want is to put him in the middle of our disagreement." There it was, the subtle reminder that she held power in this house, that any conflict between us would force Dad to choose sides. She was already laying groundwork for her victim narrative, positioning herself as the peacemaker trying to heal a rift I had created. "I appreciate that," I said, maintaining my neutral tone. Diana studied my face carefully, clearly trying to gauge whether her apology was working. When I didn't immediately respond with forgiveness and gratitude, her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The warmth in her eyes cooled by a few degrees. "I hope you'll think about what I said yesterday," she continued, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "About making plans for your future. Not because I want to get rid of you, but because I think you'd be happier with your own space, your own independence." "I'll definitely think about it." "Good." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know this transition period is hard for everyone, but I really believe we can work through this as a family." After she left, I immediately started a new recording and documented her visit while the details were fresh. Her apology had been carefully crafted to sound reasonable while avoiding any real admission of wrongdoing. She'd managed to apologize for losing her temper without acknowledging that she'd hit me, and she'd renewed her pressure for me to move out while framing it as concern for my happiness. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and if I hadn't spent months learning to recognize her tactics, I might have fallen for it. Rebecca's flight landed at 3, and I picked her up at the airport while Dad finished his meetings with lawyers and accountants. She emerged from the terminal looking like she was dressed for battle, her professional demeanor radiating the kind of authority that made junior associates nervous and opposing counsel respectful. "How are you holding up?" she asked as we drove toward the house. "Better now that you're here. Dad's been incredible since he heard the recordings, but I've been dreading facing Diana alone." "You're not alone anymore. And after what I heard last night, I have some very specific questions for your stepmother." "What kind of questions?" Rebecca pulled out a legal pad covered in her precise handwriting. "I've been researching Diana's background since we talked. There are some interesting gaps in her story that I think your father should know about." "What kind of gaps?" "Employment history that doesn't quite add up. References from previous jobs that lead to disconnected numbers. A marriage before your father that she somehow never mentioned to him." I nearly swerved into the next lane. She was married before? "Briefly, to a man named Robert Chen in Nevada, divorced after 18 months under circumstances that involved a restraining order." "A restraining order?" "Domestic violence. Apparently Diana has a pattern of behavior that escalates when she doesn't get her way." The implications of that information hit me like a physical blow. Diana wasn't just manipulative, she was potentially dangerous. And Dad had been living with her, trusting her, completely unaware of her history. Does Dad know? Not yet. I wanted to verify everything before I shared it with him. But Zara, this changes things. If Diana has a history of violence, we need to be very careful about how we handle the confrontation. We spent the drive discussing strategy. Rebecca had already consulted with a colleague who specialized in domestic abuse cases, and they'd outlined a plan for safely confronting Diana while protecting ourselves legally. The key was presenting the evidence in a controlled environment with witnesses present, making it impossible for Diana to deny or deflect what we'd discovered. Dad was waiting for us when we arrived, his face grim but determined. He'd spent the day learning things about Diana that he'd never suspected, and the revelations had clearly shaken him. "How bad is it?" Rebecca asked immediately. "Worse than we thought." Dad handed her a folder thick with documents. "My lawyer ran a background check. Diana's been lying about almost everything since the day I met her." I sat down heavily on the couch as Dad and Rebecca went through the findings. Diana's real employment history was spotty, filled with jobs she'd left under questionable circumstances. Her educational background was embellished. She'd attended community college for 2 semesters, not the 4-year degree she'd claimed. Her previous marriage wasn't just undisclosed. It had ended with her ex-husband filing for a protection order after she'd allegedly threatened him with a knife during an argument. "There's more," Dad continued, his voice hollow. "She's been accessing my financial accounts without permission. Not stealing exactly, but monitoring my spending, my investments, tracking every transaction I make." "That's financial surveillance," Rebecca said grimly. "Classic controlling behavior." "And this," Dad pulled out a bank statement. 3 months ago, she opened a credit card in my name. She's been making purchases and paying the minimum balance, probably building up debt that I'll be responsible for." The scope of Diana's deception was staggering. She hadn't just been emotionally abusive, she'd been systematically preparing to financially entangle herself with Dad in ways that would make separation difficult and expensive. "We need to move quickly," Rebecca said. "Tomorrow morning we confront her with everything: the recordings, the background check, the financial irregularities. We give her one chance to leave voluntarily and quietly, and if she refuses, we pursue every legal option available." "What if she gets violent?" I asked, thinking about the restraining order. "That's why I'm staying here tonight," Rebecca replied.
And why I've already spoken to the local police about the situation. They're aware that we may need to call them tomorrow. Dad looked older than I'd ever seen him, aged by the weight of realizing how completely he'd been deceived. "I can't believe I brought this woman into our home, into our family. I'm so sorry, Zara." "Dad, you couldn't have known. She's been planning this deception for years." But I could see in his eyes that he was already replaying every moment of their relationship, looking for signs he'd missed, warnings he'd ignored. The guilt was going to eat at him for a long time. That evening, we had dinner together while Diana worked late at her supposed job. In reality, Rebecca had discovered that Diana had been fired from her position 2 months ago for falsifying expense reports, but she'd been leaving the house every day and pretending to go to work. Even that small detail was part of her elaborate web of lies. "I keep thinking about all the times she made me doubt myself," I said as we cleared the dishes. "All the times she convinced me I was overreacting or misremembering things. She's been gaslighting me so systematically that I started questioning my own sanity." "That's what abusers do," Rebecca explained. "They isolate their victims and undermine their confidence until the victim believes they're the problem. You weren't imagining things, Zara. Your instincts were right all along." Diana arrived home around 9, full of cheerful chatter about her fictional workday. She greeted Rebecca with perfectly calibrated surprise and delight, as if my aunt's unexpected visit was the most wonderful thing that could have happened. "Rebecca, what a lovely surprise! Marcus didn't tell me you were coming to visit." "It was a last-minute decision," Rebecca replied evenly. "I wanted to spend some time with family." "Of course, it's been far too long. You'll have to stay in the guest room, I insist. We have so much to catch up on." I watched Diana work her charm, transforming into the warm, welcoming hostess she played whenever outsiders were present. She asked about Rebecca's flight, her work, her life in general. She was attentive, engaging, and completely convincing in her performance as the caring stepmother thrilled to see extended family.
Zara and I were just talking about how important family connections are, Diana said, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. We had a little disagreement yesterday, but we've worked it out, haven't we, sweetheart? The casual rewriting of our confrontation was breathtaking in its audacity. In Diana's version, we'd had a minor disagreement that had been resolved through mature communication. The slap, the threats, the cruelty had all been erased and replaced with a heartwarming story of family growth. It was definitely a learning experience, I managed to say. That's what family is for, Diana continued, supporting each other through difficult times and helping each other grow. Rebecca nodded politely, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was studying Diana, cataloging every word and gesture, building her case for tomorrow's confrontation. The evening passed in surreal normalcy. Diana played the perfect hostess, making tea, asking thoughtful questions, sharing amusing stories about her day. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought she was genuinely delighted by Rebecca's visit. She was that good at her performance. But I noticed the small tells. The way her smile tightened when Rebecca mentioned staying for several days. The slight edge in her voice when Dad announced he'd be working from home tomorrow. The calculating look in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. Diana knew something was different, even if she couldn't identify exactly what it was. Around 11, we all went to bed. Diana kissed Dad goodnight with genuine affection, hugged Rebecca warmly, and even gave me a gentle squeeze on the shoulder. "I'm so glad we're all together," she said. "Family means everything." I lay awake for hours, listening to the house settle around me. Tomorrow would change everything. Tomorrow, Diana's carefully constructed world would come crashing down, and I had no idea how she would react. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had allies, people who believed me and were willing to fight for me. The next morning dawned gray and cold, matching the mood in the house. Dad had barely slept, and Rebecca was up before dawn reviewing her notes and preparing for what was essentially a legal deposition. I made coffee with shaking hands, my nerves on edge, despite feeling more supported than I had in years. Diana came downstairs at her usual time, perfectly groomed and cheerfully oblivious to what was waiting for her. She made small talk about the weather, asked if anyone wanted her special French toast, and generally maintained her performance as the ideal wife and stepmother. "Actually, Diana," Dad said as she moved toward the kitchen, "we need to talk, all of us." Something in his tone made her pause. She looked around the room, taking in our serious expressions, the formal way we were all sitting in the living room rather than scattered around the kitchen as usual. "Is everything all right?" she asked, but I could hear the wariness creeping into her voice. "Please sit down," Rebecca said, gesturing to the chair across from us. "We have some things we need to discuss." Diana remained standing for a moment, her eyes darting between us as if she was calculating her options. Finally, she sat down, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap with practiced composure. "This sounds serious," she said with a light laugh. "Did someone die?" "No one died," Dad said heavily, "but there are some things about yesterday that we need to address." Diana's expression shifted subtly, the warm openness replaced by something cooler and more guarded. "Yesterday?" "The incident with Zara," Dad continued, "the argument that ended with you hitting her." For just a moment, Diana's mask slipped completely. I saw surprise, anger, and calculation flicker across her face before she regained control and summoned her most bewildered expression. "Hitting her?" Diana's voice rose with perfectly performed shock. "Marcus, what are you talking about? I would never hurt Zara." "We have recordings, Diana," I said quietly. "Your voice, your words, the sound of the slap. All of it." The silence that followed was electric. Diana stared at me as if I'd just pulled a gun, her mind racing to process this new information. I could practically see her trying to figure out how much we knew and what her options were. "Recordings?" she repeated slowly. Rebecca leaned forward, pulling out her legal pad. "We also have your employment records, Diana, your real employment records, including the fact that you were fired 2 months ago for expense fraud." Another crack in the facade. Diana's composure slipped further as she realized the scope of what we'd discovered. "And your marriage records," Rebecca continued remorselessly.
All of them, including the restraining order Robert Chen filed against you in Nevada. That's when Diana's mask finally fell away completely. The warm, concerned stepmother disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd only seen glimpses of before. This was Diana with nothing left to lose, and it was terrifying. "You've been busy," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "We had to be," Dad replied, "because apparently everything you've told me for the past 4 years has been a lie." Diana stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she spoke again, her voice was completely different, devoid of the warmth and emotion she'd always projected. "Not everything was a lie, Marcus. I do love you. I love this house, this life, the security you've given me. I just love myself more." The casual admission was chilling in its honesty. This was Diana without pretense, acknowledging her manipulation while showing no remorse for it. "So what happens now?" she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "We had to be," Dad replied, "because apparently everything you've told me for the past 4 years has been a lie." Diana stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she spoke again, her voice was completely different, devoid of the warmth and emotion she'd always projected. "Not everything was a lie, Marcus. I do love you. I love this house, this life, the security you've given me. I just love myself more." The casual admission was chilling in its honesty. This was Diana without pretense, acknowledging her manipulation while showing no remorse for it. "So what's it going to be?" she asked, looking around the room like a chess player studying the board. "You kick me out? Divorce me? Try to prosecute me for defending myself against your unstable daughter?" "You didn't defend yourself," I said, standing up to face her. "You attacked me. And then you threatened to have me committed if I didn't do what you wanted." Diana smiled, and it was one of the most unsettling things I'd ever seen. "Prove it." "We have the recordings." "Do you? Audio recordings that could have been edited, manipulated, or completely fabricated? Good luck with that in court." Rebecca stood as well, her professional authority filling the room. "Actually, Diana, we have a lot more than just audio recordings. We have financial records showing fraud, employment records showing deception, and a pattern of behavior documented across multiple relationships. This isn't just about what happened yesterday. This is about a systematic pattern of abuse and manipulation." "And what exactly are you proposing to do about it?" "You have 2 choices," Dad said, standing to join us. "You can leave quietly, today, with a reasonable settlement and no criminal charges. Or you can fight this, and we'll pursue every legal option available to us." Diana considered this for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was perfectly calm. "You really think you're going to win this? You think your precious recordings and background checks are going to stand up in court?" "I think the truth has a way of coming out," Rebecca replied evenly. Diana laughed, actually laughed, as if Rebecca had told the funniest joke she'd ever heard. "The truth? Let me tell you about the truth. The truth is that Marcus was a pathetic widower when I met him, so lost in grief that he could barely function. The truth is that Zara was a spoiled brat who expected the world to revolve around her dead mother's memory. The truth is that I gave both of you exactly what you needed: structure, stability, and someone willing to make the hard decisions you were too weak to make yourselves." The venom in her voice was breathtaking. This was Diana unleashed, saying everything she'd been thinking for years but had been too smart to voice. "I turned this house into a home," she continued. "I pulled Marcus out of his depression. I tried to help Zara grow up and become independent. And this is how you repay me? By ganging up on me with lawyers and accusations?" "You hit her," Dad said, his voice shaking with controlled anger. "You threatened her. You stole from me. You lied about everything. I disciplined a disrespectful child and provided some tough love to a man who needed direction.
Everything else is just your interpretation of my methods." The casual way she dismissed her abuse while reframing it as beneficial was almost impressive in its audacity. Diana genuinely believed, or had convinced herself, that her manipulation and control had been good for us. "Your methods included physical violence," Rebecca pointed out. "One slap, one moment of justified frustration with a young woman who was completely out of line. Hardly the crime of the century. And the financial fraud? Managing household finances that my husband was too distracted to handle properly. Everything I did was for the good of this family." It was clear that Diana was never going to admit wrongdoing or show genuine remorse. In her mind, she was the victim of our ingratitude, the misunderstood benefactor who had been trying to help us despite our resistance. "So what's it going to be, Diana?" Dad asked. "The easy way or the hard way?" Diana was quiet for a long moment, studying our faces and calculating her odds. Finally, she smiled that cold, calculating smile that had replaced her earlier warmth. "You know what? I think I'll take the hard way, because you've forgotten something important in all your planning and scheming." "What's that?" Rebecca asked. "I know things about this family that none of you want to become public. Secrets that would destroy your reputations and relationships if they came out in a messy court battle." The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Diana was playing her final card, threatening to air our private business and family secrets if we didn't back down. "What secrets?" Dad asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. "Your drinking problem after Sarah died, for starters. The months when you were so drunk that Zara was essentially raising herself. The financial mistakes you made in your grief that nearly cost you the business. The affairs you had before you met me when you were trying to numb your pain with meaningless relationships." Each revelation hit Dad like a physical blow. Diana had been collecting ammunition for years, storing away every vulnerable moment and private confession for exactly this situation. "And Zara," Diana continued, turning her cold gaze on me, "your eating disorder sophomore year, your struggles with depression, the self-harm that you think no one knows about, the therapy sessions that your father paid for but never wanted to discuss." I felt the blood drain from my face. Diana had been watching, listening, cataloging every moment of vulnerability and turning it into a weapon. "All of that becomes public record in a divorce proceeding," Diana explained with false sympathy. "Your friends, neighbors, business associates will all know exactly how dysfunctional this family really is. Is that really what you want?" The room fell silent as the implications of her threat sank in.
Diana had spent years positioning herself not just as the perfect wife and stepmother, but as the keeper of our darkest secrets. She was betting that our desire for privacy would outweigh our need for justice. But she had made one crucial miscalculation. She had assumed that shame would make us back down, that we would choose to protect our reputations over protecting ourselves. What she didn't understand was that secrets only have power when you're afraid of them being revealed. "You're absolutely right," Rebecca said calmly. "All of that would become public record." Diana smiled triumphantly, thinking she'd won. "Which is why," Rebecca continued, "we're not going to pursue divorce proceedings." Diana's smile faltered slightly, confusion replacing confidence. "We're going to file criminal charges." The color drained from Diana's face as Rebecca's words sank in. Criminal charges meant police reports, investigations, and public records that would follow Diana wherever she went. It meant her carefully constructed new identity would be permanently destroyed, replaced by a criminal record that would make it impossible for her to reinvent herself with another unsuspecting victim. "Criminal charges?" Diana's voice cracked slightly, the first genuine emotion she'd shown since dropping her mask. "For what?" "Assault and battery for starters," Rebecca replied, consulting her legal pad. "Financial fraud, identity theft for the credit card, and depending on what else we find, potentially stalking and harassment charges based on your pattern of behavior." "You can't prove any of that." "Actually, we can. The recordings provide clear evidence of the assault and the threats. The financial records document the fraud.
And your employment history shows a pattern of deceptive behavior that will support the other charges. Diana looked around the room desperately, her composed facade cracking further with each passing second. She'd built her entire strategy around the assumption that we would want to keep things private, that the threat of public embarrassment would be enough to secure her position. The reality that we were willing to make everything public had clearly never occurred to her. "Marcus," she said, turning to my father with a pleading tone that sounded nothing like the woman who had been threatening us moments before. "You can't seriously be considering this. Think about your reputation, your business. Think about what this will do to our life together." "What life together?" Dad replied coldly. "The life built on lies? The life where you systematically abused my daughter while convincing me she was the problem? The life where you stole from me and threatened my child with institutionalization? I was trying to help both of you. By hitting Zara, by threatening her, by lying about everything from your education to your employment." Diana's eyes darted between us, looking for any sign of weakness or hesitation. When she found none, something desperate entered her expression. "Fine," she said, her voice taking on a hard edge. "If you want to play this game, let's play. But don't think for a second that I'm going down alone. You have no idea what I'm capable of when I'm pushed into a corner." The threat was unmistakable, and it sent a chill through the room. This was Diana at her most dangerous, backed into a corner with nothing left to lose. "Is that another threat?" Rebecca asked calmly, making a note on her pad. "Because I should mention that we're recording this conversation as well." Diana spun around to look for hidden recording devices, her paranoia finally catching up with the reality of how thoroughly she'd been exposed. "Every word you've said since you sat down has been documented," Rebecca continued, "including your admission that you hit Zara, your acknowledgement of the financial irregularities, and now your threats against my family. You can't record me without my consent." "Actually, we can. This is a one-party consent state, and Zara consented to the recording. Everything you've said here today is admissible in court." The legal trap Rebecca had set was perfect. Diana had walked into this conversation thinking she held all the cards, only to discover that every word she spoke was being used to build the case against her. "I want a lawyer," Diana said finally. "That's your right," Rebecca agreed, "but I should warn you that your position is already quite precarious. Every day you delay in resolving this situation is another day we're gathering evidence and building our case. Your best option at this point is to accept a reasonable settlement and leave quietly." "What kind of settlement?" Dad stepped forward, his voice firm and businesslike. "You leave today. You take your personal belongings and nothing else. You sign a confession admitting to the assault and the financial fraud. In exchange, we don't press criminal charges, and you receive a modest financial settlement, enough to start over somewhere else." "How modest?" "Enough for a security deposit and a few months of expenses. Consider it severance pay for 4 years of employment as a professional manipulator." The insult hit Mark. Diana's face flushed with anger, but she was clearly calculating whether the offer was better than her alternatives. "And if I refuse?" "Then we file charges this afternoon," Rebecca said matter-of-factly. "We've already prepared all the paperwork. The police are expecting our call. Your former employer has agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Your ex-husband in Nevada is very interested in speaking with prosecutors about your patterns of behavior." "Robert!" Diana's voice came out as barely a whisper. "He's been keeping track of your activities since your divorce. Apparently, he's been waiting years for someone to finally call you to account for your behavior. He has documentation going back to your marriage that corroborates everything we've discovered." The revelation that her past was catching up with her seemed to break something fundamental in Diana's composure. She sat down heavily, her hands shaking as she processed the scope of the evidence arrayed against her. "You have 1 hour to decide," Dad said. "Take the settlement and leave, or face the consequences of your actions in court." Diana looked up at him with something that might have been genuine emotion for the first time since I'd known her. "I really did love you, Marcus. That part wasn't a lie." "No," Dad replied sadly. "You loved what I could give you. You loved the security, the house, the lifestyle, but you never loved me enough to be honest with me, and you certainly never loved me enough to treat my daughter with basic human decency. She was never going to accept me. She tried to accept you. For 4 years, she tried to build a relationship with you while you systematically tore her down. The problem was never Zara, Diana. The problem was always you. The finality in his voice seemed to register with Diana that this conversation was truly over. There would be no more manipulation, no more second chances, no more opportunities to rewrite the narrative in her favor. I need to make some phone calls, she said finally. You can make them from a hotel, Rebecca replied.
You're not staying in this house tonight. My things can be packed and delivered to wherever you're staying, but you leave now, today, and you don't come back. Diana stood slowly, her movements mechanical and defeated. The confident, manipulative woman who had entered this conversation was gone, replaced by someone who looked smaller, older, and utterly lost. "I'll take the settlement," she said quietly. The next few hours were a blur of legal documentation, supervised packing, and tense negotiations over exactly what Diana would be allowed to take with her. Rebecca had insisted on supervising everything to ensure that Diana didn't try to steal additional items or plant evidence that could complicate future proceedings. I watched from my bedroom window as Diana loaded her belongings into her car. 4 years of marriage reduced to a few suitcases and boxes. She'd brought so little with her when she'd moved in, and she was leaving with barely more, despite having lived here for years. At one point, she looked up at my window, and our eyes met through the glass. For just a moment, I saw something that might have been regret or sadness. But then her expression hardened again, and she turned away to finish loading her car. Dad stood in the driveway as she prepared to leave, holding the paper she'd signed, admitting to the assault and financial fraud. The settlement check was modest as promised, enough to help her start over, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle she'd become accustomed to. "This isn't over," Diana said as she got into her car. "Yes, it is," Dad replied firmly. "And if you try to contact any of us, or if you violate any part of this agreement, those charges get filed immediately." Diana drove away without another word, leaving behind a family that was finally free to heal from years of manipulation and abuse. The silence that followed her departure was profound. For the first time in 4 years, our house felt peaceful. There was no underlying tension, no need to watch our words or moderate our behavior to avoid setting off Diana's volatile moods. "How are you feeling?" Rebecca asked, finding me sitting on the front porch an hour later. "Exhausted," I admitted, "and relieved, and angry, and sad. I think I'm feeling everything at once." "That's normal. You've been living in survival mode for so long that it's going to take time to process everything that's happened." Dad joined us on the porch, looking like he'd aged a decade in the past few days. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, all the times I chose to believe her over you. I don't know how to forgive myself for that." "You don't have to carry that guilt forever," I said. "Diana was extremely good at what she did. She fooled everyone, not just you. But I was supposed to protect you. That was my job as your father, and I failed." Rebecca put a hand on his shoulder. "Marcus, predators like Diana are experts at finding and exploiting vulnerabilities. She targeted you because you were grieving and vulnerable, and she used your love for your daughter against both of you. You're not the first person to be deceived by someone like her, and you won't be the last." Over the following days, the true extent of Diana's deception continued to unfold. The private investigator Rebecca had hired uncovered additional evidence of Diana's past manipulations, including 2 other relationships that had ended under similar circumstances. There was a pattern stretching back years of Diana targeting widowed or divorced men with children, using her supposed maternal instincts to gain access to their families and resources. "She's done this before," Rebecca explained as we reviewed the investigator's report, "multiple times. She finds vulnerable men, gains their trust, gradually isolates them from their support systems, and then systematically dismantles their relationships with their children." "Why?" I asked. "What does she get out of it?" "Control, security, and in some cases, financial gain. 2 of her previous relationships ended with the men signing over significant assets to her before she disappeared." The realization that Diana had been following a well-practiced playbook was both horrifying and validating. It explained why her manipulation had been so sophisticated, why she'd seemed to anticipate our reactions so accurately.
We hadn't been her first victims, and if we hadn't stopped her, we wouldn't have been her last. Dad spent hours going through financial records, identifying additional instances of Diana's deception. She'd been systematically siphoning small amounts from various accounts, amounts too small to be noticed individually, but significant when added together over time. She stole almost $15,000 over the past 2 years, he told us. Small transfers, fake expenses, cash withdrawals that she claimed were for household needs. Are you going to pursue charges for that too? I'm considering it. The confession she signed covers the credit card fraud, but this is separate theft that happened over an extended period. Rebecca advised against additional charges unless Diana violated the terms of her departure agreement. You have her confession and the settlement. Unless she tries to retaliate or contact you again, it's better to let this chapter close completely. But closing this chapter meant opening a new one, and neither Dad nor I was entirely sure what that looked like. We'd spent so long living under Diana's manipulation that we needed to relearn how to be a family without the constant undercurrent of tension and deception. The healing process started small. Dad and I began having breakfast together again, something Diana had gradually discouraged by claiming that morning was her special time with her husband. We started watching movies on weekends, sharing stories about Mom, and generally rediscovering the relationship that Diana had spent 4 years trying to erode. I missed this, Dad said one evening as we sat in the living room, sharing a pizza and watching one of Mom's favorite films. I missed just being comfortable with my daughter. I missed having a father who believed me, I replied. I was starting to think you'd chosen Diana permanently. I never chose her over you, Zara. I was just so afraid of losing the family I'd managed to rebuild that I didn't want to see the problems that might threaten it. But I was part of that family too. You were the most important part, and I'm sorry it took me so long to remember that. The extended family rallied around us in the weeks following Diana's departure. Aunt Rebecca stayed for another week, helping us navigate the legal and emotional aftermath. Uncle David visited with his family, bringing a kind of normalcy and joy that had been missing from our house for years. Grandma Helen made her first extended visit in years, staying for 2 weeks and helping us sort through Mom's belongings that Diana had been gradually hiding or disposing of. Many things were gone forever, but we recovered more than I'd expected. She kept most of the valuable pieces, Grandma Helen observed, as we went through jewelry boxes and photo albums, the things she could sell or wear. But she didn't understand the value of the personal items, so she just boxed them up and put them in the attic. We found letters Mom had written to me before she died, intended to be given to me at various milestones. We found photo albums from my childhood that Diana had claimed were lost. We found my mother's recipe collection, her gardening journals, and dozens of other small treasures that Diana had deemed unimportant. She was erasing Mom from our house, I realized as we worked. Piece by piece, she was making it like she'd never existed. That's what women like Diana do, Grandma Helen explained. They can't compete with the memory of a beloved wife and mother, so they try to eliminate the competition by removing all traces of her. The process of reclaiming our home and our memories was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Each recovered photo, each rediscovered memento was a small victory against Diana's campaign to rewrite our family history. Meanwhile, word of Diana's departure had begun to spread through our social circle. Dad had crafted a simple explanation that Diana had decided to relocate for career opportunities and that they had separated amicably. Most people accepted this at face value, but a few perceptive friends and neighbors had questions. Mrs. Henderson from next door came by with a casserole and some pointed observations.
I always thought there was something off about that woman, she confided to Dad as they talked in the garden. The way she talked about Zara when you weren't around. Nothing you could put your finger on, but it never felt quite right. What kind of things did she say? Oh, just little comments here and there. How difficult it must be for you, having an adult daughter still living at home. How she worried that Zara was too dependent on you. Nothing outright mean, but it always felt like she was trying to plant seeds of doubt. Similar stories emerged from other neighbors and friends. Diana had been conducting a subtle campaign to undermine my reputation throughout the community, laying groundwork for the day when she would push Dad to make me leave home. She was more thorough than we realized, Rebecca observed when we shared these revelations with her over the phone. She wasn't just working on your immediate family, she was building a narrative with your entire social circle. Thank God we documented everything, Dad said. If this had come down to a he said, she said situation, she might have had enough community support to make her story believable. 3 weeks after Diana's departure, we received our first indication that she was trying to rebuild her life somewhere else. A woman named Jennifer Martinez called our house, identifying herself as a private investigator working for a client who was considering entering into a business relationship with Diana. I understand this is an unusual request, Martinez explained, but my client wanted me to verify some information about Diana's background and character references. Dad and Rebecca exchanged glances before Dad responded. What kind of information are you looking for? Employment history, character references, anything that might be relevant to her suitability as a business partner. I think you should speak with my sister, Dad said. She's an attorney and can better advise you on what information we can legally share. The conversation that followed revealed that Diana had apparently found another target. She was attempting to partner with a widowed businessman in Arizona, claiming to have extensive experience in hospitality management and stellar references from her previous employment. Everything she's told my client appears to be fabricated, Martinez explained to Rebecca. Her educational background, her employment history, even her claim to have been recently widowed herself. I've been hired to conduct due diligence, and nothing about her story checks out. Rebecca provided Martinez with contact information for Diana's former employer and suggested that the investigator might want to speak with law enforcement about Diana's pattern of deceptive behavior. We're not pressing charges as long as she stays away from our family, Rebecca explained, but that doesn't mean we're going to help her victimize someone else. The knowledge that Diana was already working on her next victim was unsettling but not surprising. People like her didn't stop their behavior, they just moved on to new targets when their current situation became untenable. At least this time, her new target is being smart about checking her background, I said, after Rebecca related the conversation to us. Hopefully it will be enough to save him from what we went through, Dad replied. As summer turned to fall, our household settled into new rhythms. I was in my final semester of college, preparing for graduation, and starting to think seriously about my future. For the first time in years, those plans felt like they were truly mine, not constrained by Diana's manipulations or her pressure for me to leave home. Dad and I talked about my post-graduation plans without the undercurrent of tension that had characterized those conversations when Diana was pushing for my departure. He offered to help me find an apartment nearby if I wanted independence, but also made it clear that I was welcome to stay at home while I got established in my career. I know I said some things over the years about you needing to become more independent, he told me one evening, but I realize now that most of that was Diana's influence. You've been remarkably independent and responsible. I was just too blind to see it. I want to get my own place eventually, I said, but it's nice to know that it's my choice, not something I'm being forced into. It will always be your choice. This is your home as much as it is mine. The sense of security those words provided was immense. For years, I'd felt like a guest in my own house, tolerated but not truly welcomed. Diana had been so effective at making me feel unwanted that I'd internalized her narrative about being a burden on my father's happiness. In October, I received an unexpected phone call from a woman named Sarah Chen. It took me a moment to place the last name, and when I did, my heart skipped a beat. I'm Robert Chen's sister, she explained. I understand that you and your family recently had dealings with Diana Walsh. Yes, I said, carefully, not sure where this conversation was heading. My brother asked me to reach out to you. He wanted to thank you for finally holding Diana accountable for her behavior. I didn't know he was aware of what happened. The police contacted him as part of their background check when you were considering filing charges. He's been waiting for years for someone to call Diana to account for what she did to him. Sarah went on to explain that Diana's abuse of her brother had been severe and systematic. She'd isolated him from his family, convinced him that his friends and relatives were trying to undermine their relationship, and gradually taken control of his finances and social connections. By the time he realized what was happening, he'd lost his job, most of his savings, and his relationship with his daughter. It took him years to rebuild his life after she left. How did he finally get free? She left him for someone else, someone with more money and better prospects. Robert was devastated at the time, but he eventually realized it was the best thing that could have happened to him. And the restraining order? That came later, when she tried to come back after her new relationship didn't work out. She showed up at his house demanding money and threatening to destroy his reputation if he didn't help her. That's when he finally understood how dangerous she really was.
The conversation with Sarah provided additional confirmation of Diana's patterns, while also offering hope that her victims could recover and rebuild their lives. Robert had gone on to remarry happily, rebuild his relationship with his daughter, and establish a successful consulting business. He wanted me to tell you that documenting everything was exactly the right approach, Sarah said before we hung up, and that he's proud of you for refusing to be silenced by her threats. As my graduation approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. A year ago, I'd been trapped in an abusive situation, doubting my own perceptions and feeling helpless against Diana's manipulations. The idea of graduation had been overshadowed by uncertainty about my future and fear of Diana's escalating hostility. Now, I was preparing to graduate with honors, planning a career that excited me, and looking forward to a future built on authentic relationships rather than manipulation and fear. The graduation ceremony itself was beautiful. Dad sat in the front row, beaming with pride as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma. Aunt Rebecca had flown in for the occasion, along with Grandma Helen and several cousins who had remained close despite Diana's efforts to distance us from extended family. "I'm so proud of you," Dad said as we celebrated afterward. "Not just for your academic achievements, but for your courage in facing down Diana. You saved both of us." "We saved each other," I corrected. "I couldn't have done it alone." "Well, you won't have to face anything alone again. We're family, and that means we support each other no matter what." A few weeks after graduation, we received a final piece of news about Diana. Jennifer Martinez called to update us on the situation in Arizona. "Your information helped prevent another victim," she reported. "When my client learned about Diana's history, he immediately ended all contact with her. We've also shared our findings with local law enforcement, since she appears to have committed fraud in her attempts to establish her here." "Is she being prosecuted?" "The district attorney is considering charges, but Diana disappeared before they could serve her with papers. She's moved on again, probably looking for a new target in a new location." It was unsatisfying to know that Diana had escaped consequences once again, but also reassuring to know that she hadn't been able to establish herself in Arizona. Each time her background was exposed, it became harder for her to find new victims. "At least she's running out of places to hide," Rebecca observed when we shared the news with her. "Every time she's exposed, it creates a digital trail that future investigators can follow." As fall turned to winter, I settled into my new job at a local law firm. The work was challenging and rewarding, and I was building relationships with colleagues who knew nothing about Diana or the drama that had dominated my life for 4 years. For the first time since Mom's death, I felt like I was living my own life rather than reacting to someone else's agenda. The constant hypervigilance that had characterized my relationship with Diana was gradually fading, replaced by a sense of security and optimism about the future.
Dad had started dating again, but this time he was approaching relationships with wisdom earned through hard experience. He'd learned to ask questions, to verify information, and to trust his instincts when something felt off. "I'm not in any hurry," he told me when I asked about his social life. "I've learned that it's better to be alone than to be with someone who doesn't genuinely care about my well-being." The lessons we'd learned from Diana's manipulation had made us both more discerning in our relationships, but they hadn't made us cynical. We'd discovered that there were people who could be trusted, family members and friends who would support us through difficult times without expecting anything in return. One evening in December, almost a year after Diana's departure, Dad and I were decorating our Christmas tree when he brought up a subject we'd been avoiding. "Do you think you'll ever be able to trust a stepmother figure again?" he asked as we hung ornaments. "I mean, if I do eventually get serious about someone, how will you feel about that?" I considered the question carefully. "I think I'll be okay, as long as she's genuine. Diana taught me what to look for in terms of red flags, and I think you've learned what questions to ask." "I have. And I promise you that I'll never again dismiss your concerns about someone I'm dating. Your opinion matters to me." "I appreciate that, but I also want you to be happy. You deserve to find love again, and I don't want my bad experience with Diana to prevent you from building a healthy relationship." "Any relationship I build in the future will have to include you," Dad said firmly. "I'm not interested in anyone who sees you as competition or an obstacle." That conversation marked another milestone in our healing process. We were able to talk about the future without the shadow of Diana's manipulation hanging over us. We could envision a household that might again include a maternal figure, but only if that person genuinely cared about both of us. Christmas that year was the most peaceful we'd had since Mom's death.
Without Diana's undercurrent of tension and manipulation, we were able to simply enjoy each other's company and remember why we'd always been close before she'd entered our lives. We invited extended family for Christmas dinner, something Diana had gradually discouraged over the years by making it increasingly stressful and complicated. This year, the house was full of laughter, genuine conversation, and the kind of warmth that had been missing for too long. "This feels like home again," Grandma Helen observed as we cleaned up after dinner. "I missed this feeling." "So did we," I replied. "We just forgot what it was supposed to feel like." As the year ended, I found myself grateful for the painful lessons we'd learned. Diana's presence in our lives had been devastating, but surviving her manipulation had made us stronger and wiser. We'd learned to recognize abuse, to trust our instincts, and to stand up for ourselves, even when doing so was difficult and scary. We'd also learned the value of documenting everything, of building support networks, and of never accepting abuse in the name of keeping peace. The recordings that had initially been a desperate attempt to maintain my sanity had ultimately been the key to our freedom. Most importantly, we'd learned that family meant people who chose to love and support each other, not people who demanded blind loyalty while systematically tearing each other down. The new year brought new opportunities and fresh starts. I was excelling in my career, building genuine friendships, and planning for a future that felt bright and full of possibilities. Dad was healing from the trauma of realizing how completely he'd been deceived, but he was also learning to trust his own judgment again. We still didn't know where Diana had ended up or whether she'd found new victims. Part of me hoped she'd learned from the experience and chosen to change her behavior, but I wasn't naive enough to believe that was likely. People like Diana rarely change, they just got better at hiding their true nature. But her failure to destroy our family had been complete. Instead of driving us apart, her manipulation had ultimately brought us closer together. Instead of succeeding in her goal of erasing Mom's memory from our home, she'd helped us rediscover and cherish those memories even more. She tried to drive a wedge between my father and me, but instead she taught us to communicate more honestly and directly. Most importantly, she tried to convince us that we were the problem, that our reactions to her behavior were unreasonable, and our desire for respect was unrealistic. But by refusing to accept her narrative and insisting on the truth, we discovered that we deserved so much better than what she was offering. The recording on my phone that captured her assault and threats was more than just evidence. It was proof that my perceptions were accurate, that my instincts were trustworthy, and that I had every right to demand better treatment. That digital file changed everything, transforming me from a victim of manipulation into someone with the power to demand justice and respect. It turned Diana's carefully constructed lies into undeniable evidence of her true character. In the end, Diana's greatest miscalculation was underestimating our capacity to fight back and our commitment to protecting each other. She assumed that shame and fear would keep us silent, that we would choose the illusion of family peace over the reality of addressing her abuse. She was wrong. And now, 2 years later, we're living the life she tried to prevent us from having: authentic, peaceful, filled with genuine love and mutual support. We're the family she claimed to be helping us become, but only after removing her toxic influence from our lives. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't getting even. It's building something so much better than what your abuser tried to destroy that their absence becomes a gift rather than a loss. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.